Well, what's up gamers? Today I'm giving my full review of the TrimUI Smart Pro. This is a really interesting entry in the $80 price range that has some fantastic strengths, but also some painful weaknesses. But could this be the device for you? Let's get into it. TrimUI kind of bucks the trend in that it doesn't use the RK3566 chipset that we see in a lot of other handhelds in this price range. The CPU is actually an Allwinner A133plus. This is a Cortex-A53 Quad-core processor that's clocked at 1.8 gigahertz. And we don't have a Mali GPU here either. We have the PowerVR GE8300, and that is clocked at 660 megahertz. One of the immediately noticeable differences is this display. We have a 16:9 display here that is 4.96 inches. This is also a 720p display with a pixel density of 294 pixels per inch. And at $80, of course, this isn't an OLED, it's an IPS display. And in my playtime with it, I would say it's just an okay display. It's not too oversaturated. To my liking, it's a little on the unsaturated side, but that's okay. The image and the text here are all very clear. We also get a 4000 milliamp hour battery in here, and TrimUI claims that this gets 6 hours of playtime. And I have to say the battery life on here is pretty good. Of course, your higher end 3D games are going to drain the battery faster, and your lower end 2D games are going to drain it slower, but there were some times when I left this just in sleep mode for a couple of days and came back and found that the battery was still going and that I was able to pick it up and play for a good length of a play session. There were even a couple of times I had this turned off for a week and would come back and it looked like it hadn't lost any battery life at all. One thing I feel like I need to mention, and this isn't a pro or a con, but just something that I think you need to know if you're going to be buying this device, is that there's a switch on the bottom of it that has an FN next to it, and that switch needs to be turned to the right, away from the FN, in order to get the full function of the processor. If it's flipped to the left next to the FN, it's some kind of battery saving mode, so you don't get the full clock speed of the CPU and GPU, which of course is going to hurt your frame rate when you're trying to run 3D games. Now if you're playing 8 and 16-bit games, flip that over to FN and you're probably going to have a much longer battery life on here than just 6 hours. And that's pretty awesome. One other thing I'll note is that I bought the 64GB model, and mine came with a card from Lexar. I was really surprised by that, and I'm still not quite sure what to think about that, because in my unboxing video that I'll link up here in the corner, I had someone comment that they bought the exact same model also from Amazon, and theirs came with a generic card and they had a lot of trouble getting it to work. So considering that, I do wonder about the quality control that goes into this product, but I can't say that firsthand I've had much problem. I will get into some of the issues I found here in a bit, but for the most part, I really enjoyed playing games on this. One of the things I know a lot of people that watch my channel will want to know is, are there Pokemon games on here? And yeah, one of the things I actually like about this is that it has this section where it has these collections of best games already put into folders basically. It has an arcade vertical shooter section where you will turn the device sideways and play with the screen up vertical, and that's really cool because it's already set to do that and the games look gorgeous. But one of the other collections slash folders is a Pokemon collection, and I know that people are going to be really excited about that. Mine came with some 43 different Pokemon games, and that has got to be hundreds and hundreds of hours of game time. Speaking of game time, the performance on here is quite good. I have almost no complaints about how this runs and how well it plays these games. Some of the systems that drive this the hardest would be the Dreamcast, the Nintendo 64, the Nintendo DS, and the PSP. Fittingly, the PSP performance is really excellent in this $80 price range, more so than any other device in this category. And I say fittingly because obviously they drew inspiration from Sony when they designed this device. So if you're interested in games from the Dreamcast, PSP era backward, this is going to do a really good job. Nintendo 64 also plays really well here. Actually, some games like Super Smash Bros., Wave Race, Perfect Dark, some of those games that are harder to run, they ran really well on this emulator. I do have to put a footnote on the performance though, because there's one system that I just couldn't quite get up and running, and it was the Nintendo DS. Now, I'm not a stranger to Drastic. I've used Drastic on many other handhelds, but the DS games down here, I just couldn't get them to run. I couldn't get the screens to switch. The buttons didn't seem to be mapped appropriately, and even if they had been, from what I could witness of how the games were running, it wasn't well. And so I don't know if the emulator just isn't optimized with the GPU or CPU here, or what the deal is, but if you're into Nintendo DS emulation, I would not get this device. If you're trying to get something under $100 and you really want to play PSP, yeah, absolutely, this is the one for you. But if you're wanting Nintendo DS support, look elsewhere, because this isn't it. And I guess that's a good segue into some of the issues here before I tell you about its strengths. And the first thing we got to talk about are these sticks. I've been using joysticks in gaming for 27 years. I've used first-party controllers, I've used third-party controllers, and I have to tell you, these are literally the worst joysticks I have ever used in my entire life. Do they work? Yeah. Does your character go in the direction you want them to? Yeah. Are they comfortable? No, not at all. They're way too short. They're practically flush with the device. They barely move to the left or right at all, and they're super slick. Your thumbs just slide right off of here. And on top of that, they lose a lot of functionality because they don't click. And when you're emulating games, you really need as many inputs as possible, especially on a device like this. There's too many hotkeys and shortcuts that you need to emulate things correctly. And so you're losing L3 and R3 right off the bat. And then on top of that, the sticks they're just awful. When you first start to push one, it feels like it's not going anywhere, and then all of a sudden, it's all the way to the left, or all the way to the right, or all the way up. I don't really know how else to describe it. It's kind of one of those things you just have to try for yourself, but the sticks really are horrible. And if they come out with a sequel to this device, I hope that they will address that, because it definitely hurts your gaming experience. One other issue that I found with this is the firmware itself. Now, the stock TrimUI firmware here isn't terrible, but I have two things I dislike about it. One is that there's no over-the-air updates, and the update process is kind of complicated. And one thing I've kind of discovered as I've been reading the comments in my other handheld reviews is that a lot of people admit that they're not that tech savvy, and so they're looking for help in how to use these devices. And the way that you update this firmware is not set up with that type of person in mind. One of the things I love about my RGB30 from Powkitty is that with GelOS, it has over-the-air updates, and all I have to do is go to the main menu and start the update. It does the rest on its own. This is a much more involved process because there is internal memory on here as well as the SD card. You have to remove the SD card, put it in your computer, go to the company's website, which doesn't work very well, by the way, then download the firmware, unzip the firmware, put part of the unzipped file on your SD card, then put the SD card back in here, then hold down a combination of buttons while you power it on so that it knows you're trying to update the firmware, and then wait and hope that it does it all right without bricking your device. I'll admit I'm used to doing these kinds of things, and I was a little bit nervous. The second thing I don't like about the firmware is that this is the only option you have. Because of how the firmware is updated through an SD card onto the internal memory, there's no way for you to flash another firmware to the device. So you can't use ArcOS or GelOS or anything else. You have to use the TrimUI's firmware. And again, it's not a terrible firmware, but some people just like to have the option. Alright, so how about the strengths? So here's some things that I do like. I do like this big screen. It's really nice. It's really nice to have that 5-inch screen, especially for those 16:9 PSP games. Seeing those games on here compared to the RGB30 or the Anbernic 353V, for example, is such a better viewing experience. Again, I wish it was a little more saturated, but the size of the image you get here for the price point is absolutely wonderful. I also really like this D-pad. It's surprisingly good. The more I played with it, the more I liked it. It has a really soft but satisfying click. I also didn't think I'd like it because it's really small. It kind of reminds me of the D-pad on the GameCube controller a little bit in terms of its size. And that D-pad always felt small to me too, but it's actually a really good D-pad. And I also really appreciate that you get the same satisfying soft click with these face buttons, and that includes the start, stop, and menu buttons on here. A lot of times all of those buttons will feel completely different, and on here it doesn't. They all feel like they're part of the same device. And I also want to mention one more time just how great the battery life is. Plus, that performance to price ratio is almost unparalleled. This really is a great bang for the buck. And last but not least, this does technically have forward-firing speakers, or at least forward-firing speaker holes. They're not the greatest speakers in the world, but I do like that the grills are on the front of the device and not behind it or on the bottom. In 2024, I really hope to see more manufacturers move to that design. And speaking of moving, why don't you move down to the description? I have affiliate links down there. It really helps out the channel a lot at no added cost to you, so if you're thinking about picking one of these up, please use those. I really appreciate it. And that about wraps it up for this review. What do you think of the TrimUI? Do you have one? Have you had any problems with it? What kind of SD card did it come with? I'd really like to know. Did you buy it specifically for PSP emulation? And if you don't mind, please hit that subscribe button and maybe that like button too, or share this with a friend. I'm working overtime to make this channel the best it can be, but I can't do it without your support. So thank you very much, and until the next one, stay kind and encouraging out there, and I'll catch you on the flippity flip.